First up, school, and the ideas that drive the way kids learn. Fewer than a third of New York City public school students passed the state reading exam last year. Math results were equally dismal. Enter Eva Moskowitz. She is the founder and CEO of the largest charter network in the city with 43 schools. Her Success Academy charter schools seem to be bucking these testing patterns. Success Academy kids pass the reading test at twice the rate of public school kids, and nearly all the students passed math. But Success Academy's strict teaching methods are controversial, and some see the network's rapid growth as a threat to the city's public schools. Eva Moskowitz is our first guest, and she's here today to talk about her approach with Atlantic contributor Amanda Ripley.
Thanks, Patrick. Good morning. It's great to be here. Can't you feel the ideas begin to flow? Especially when you're walking up all those stairs, which we know is so good for your brain. That's all part of the plan here. Eva, it's great to see you.
Be here.
We heard a little bit from Patrick about the results your schools have gotten. And I want to be specific, if I can, just for a second, particularly in math. So math, as you may know, is our national Achilles heel. At every income level and every age level, we struggle with math compared to people around the world, even our wealthiest kids. So math, last year, if I have this right, 1 out of 3 New York City students reached the level of proficiency. At Success Academy charter schools, 9 out of 10, right?
That's correct.
And this is not a small chain. Like, this is a large network of schools. I think you'll be educating 11,000 kids next year, is that right?
This summer.
This summer. Okay, starting this summer. So in a word, how do you do this? What is your secret? Tell us.
I would say there are many factors that go into great schooling, but one of the central things we do is not intellectually underestimate children. And we don't believe that height and intelligence are the same things. And kids may be short, but they are not stupid. And giving them a rigorous problem, if you ask a good question, you'll get a better answer. If you ask a low-level question, you'll get a low-level answer. And so we are in the top 1% in math in the state of New York, in part because we ask hard questions.
Now, this is countercultural in some ways, right? Like, I remember reading that you train your kindergarten teachers not to talk in a sing-song voice to kindergartners. That is kind of goes against the grain. Is there a secret for how you do that? I mean, how do you, is it about leadership? Is it about training? Is it about the culture?
Then why are we asking it?
Right.
The point is to puzzle through it and figure out what are the tools in your toolbox to try and figure out the answer to a question. And it requires a lot of self-discipline on the part of the teacher to not save the kid each time, or to really give leading information so that the children do not have to think.
And it's also much more intellectually challenging, I would assume, and more interesting, perhaps, as a teacher, to be not sort of leading the path to every
answer? It's much more interesting for the kids and much more interesting for the teacher. I think we have accepted boredom in schooling in a way that is incredibly detrimental to both the children and the adults. And we put at Success Academies an incredible premium on engagement. Not only intellectual engagement in terms of rigor, but the art, the dance, the music, the sports, the chess, the science. We take the attitude, if kids were free not to go to school, meaning there were no laws that required kindergarten, and parents did not need childcare, which is pretty hard to imagine. I know we're both mothers. But if that were the case, would the children decide to go to school? And I believe in many cases they would not. And if you look at the truancy rates, they do not. And even within the school, you have to ask yourself, if the kids had the freedom to walk in and out of the classrooms, and by the way, at Success Academy, they do not have that freedom. But if they did have the freedom, would they choose to stay, or would they want to go? That's a really important question for schools to ask, and we ask it daily. And what we find is that people think about engagement and creativity. The teachers, the principals, the home office, we've got a cadre of people who are always asking themselves, is this sufficiently engaging? Is there anything else we could be doing to make schooling far more engaging? And there always is. And by the way, the kids have ideas too about what would be more engaging.
Definitely. And I think, boredom is actually a plague that shadows kids all over the world in school. And it's funny how we defend it. I've had parents say to me, well, that's part of school, being bored. You have to get used to that because you're going to be bored in your job. And I'm like, well, that's an inspiring vision for the future. So look, we talked about the test scores. Tests are a very unsatisfying and incomplete measure of what a school is doing, although they are relatively objective. How do you know if you're teaching kids to think for themselves and be true scholars, as you call them, and how do you know? Or are you just teaching them to take tests?
Oh my goodness, no. Both as a parent and as the leader of an educational organization, and I strongly believe in the Common Core, and I strongly believe in testing and assessments. That's not the end goal. First of all, because they're still too low level. That is not going to allow our kids to graduate from college and be successful. Kids need to learn how to write and think and advocate for themselves. There are a whole bunch of life skills, intellectual skills that the kids need. But they do have to get over this hurdle of tests. They do have to take their SATs, and I believe the school has a moral obligation, particularly for poor kids, to do that support work. Affluent parents do that for those kids. So we prepare them, of course, for all the tests that they have to take. But what I'm interested in is, can the kids hypothesize about the relationship between the weight of the propeller and the velocity at which it falls? That is a scientific experiment that the kids do. We do aerodynamics in first grade. We're one of the only schools in the nation that teach science, discovery-oriented science, 5 days a week. So our kindergartners will have done 135 experiments by the end of kindergarten. Do the kids have insights about science? Can they speculate about what might be going on? Do they have good educated guesses? And the only way to really judge that is to look at the teaching and the learning. There's a qualitative aspect to this. And then we also write assessments that, frankly, are far more rigorous than the state tests, in order to tell, if you throw a piece of literature at the kid, a piece of poetry that they have not read before, can they puzzle their way through it and tell you what the deepest meaning of the poem is, and can they write about it in an intelligent way, it's pretty easy to tell at what level you're educating the children at. And look, we are a work in progress. This is very humbling work. It's not like you cross off your list. We opened our first high school this summer. It's hard. It's hard to close the gap. It's hard to create educational nirvana, which is what we are going for. It's really hard. I joke one of the hardest is math. Math is taught as a bunch of card tricks, and we don't teach math that way. And if you're looking even for math problems, the math problems in America have been sketched out as 4 steps. Everything is 4 steps. And that's not the way the world works. Kids have to get an open-ended problem where they have no steps and they just have to figure it out.
So how do you find good math problems? You just Google it? Or you just
No, I wish it were that simple, because most of the math problems in America are broken down and they're not of high quality. And so you really have to look internationally for good problems, and you have to sort them. There's also some level of beta testing. A problem can be too hard, so you have to give it to a bunch of kindergartners and see, can they puzzle their way? What level of support do you need to give them for them to figure it out?
When you find good problems, do you share it across the network, or how does that work?
Not only do we share it across the network, but we are sharing much more broadly than that. At Success Academies, we do a tremendous amount of sharing because we're not simply interested in our own children, although we care deeply about them and love them very much. We really are interested in reimagining public education.
Let's talk about that. I think one of the dreams of having charter schools was that they would be laboratories, right, for innovation and experimentation, and then they would go and share what they learned, and the other schools would learn from them, and it would spread, and it would be wonderful. What I have seen in my own reporting, and particularly in Washington, D.C., where I live, is that that is not happening for a variety of reasons. So then the only way to have this spread is to have more and more and more charter schools, which has its own challenges, right? As a parent trying to find a school when you have a lot of school choice like you do in Washington, D.C., way more than in New York, it is challenging. And I know a little bit about education, and I had spreadsheets, I had data, I had interviews. It was a nightmare. So how can we get to a place where schools are actually sharing? Now, I hear you're saying that you're pushing information out, but it's not always being received, right? How could we, bit by bit, chip away at that competition that is kind of creating a barrier to sharing?
I'm not sure it's the competition that is creating the barrier. I think it's ironic that educational organizations are not always learning is not always highly valued in the educational organization. We have a learning culture from the top of the food chain to the bottom of the food chain. The kids are learners, the teachers are learning, the principals are learners, the superintendents are learners. We go on an incredible number of school visits. We go to charters, we go to district, we go to parochial schools, we go to independent schools, because we are trying to build a better educational mousetrap. And we are on a mission to find the best way to educate kids within our values. So we're not a single-sex school, we're co-ed, and so that's not going to change. But within our values, we're trying to really understand what are the best ways to do things? How can we do it in a way that is best for the children, that takes social and emotional learning into account, which is financially replicable, because that's a constraint of ours? How do you do all that in an effective manner? I don't find that every educational organization is out there knocking down the doors to try and figure out how do we do this better and faster and in a more financially viable way, and I would argue that that's part of the problem.
Yeah, and I guess I would say, I think when we all think about our own experiences in the workplace, a lot of that is sort of top down. If the leadership is constantly encouraging you to go out and learn and read new things and experiment, then it tends to be a cultural value of the place. So when you send out an invitation to New York City principals to come join you in some learning process, what percentage come?
It's very small. We do a lot of day-long workshops on special ed. We did a 2-day one on mathematics. We do it on every imaginable subject, and we'll get 1%. It's interesting to me. It's interesting to me that the Chancellor of the City of New York, who I know quite well, Carmen Farina, has literally been in our building about a dozen times and has never come to our floor.
So they share buildings. If you could just explain, the reason she's there is visiting the traditional
She's
public school?
Visiting the district school, and I go to many of her schools because I'm interested.
Well, have you invited her?
Yes, many times, many times. But I do think it sometimes goes unrecognized that you really have to be curious. I find actually in hiring teachers, one of the central qualities that I'm looking for is the teacher a learner? Do they love learning? Because we're trying to get our kids to fall in love with learning, and it's hard to do that if the adults are not passionate.
Right, definitely. I don't know how you select for that. I guess you can tell in talking to people, but it's hard. Aside from this is sort of an uncertain moment for education reform in the United States. There's been a backlash against the Common Core from right and left. There's been a lot of protests of testing, some opt-outs in different places. Has anyone opted out of test any students in Success Academy charter schools?
No, but the teachers union called all of our families to urge them to opt out, but they did not.
Work?
No, it did not work.
Can they opt out?
They can.
Okay.
They can.
So another big issue that's come up a lot is the ways that discipline has worked in schools, and the ways that in many places it seems to disproportionately affect African American and Latino kids, leading them as sort of ushering them into the criminal justice system when they're sometimes very small. In your own case, right, I believe I have this right, last year your 22 schools suspended 11% of your students versus 4% in traditional schools. How do you explain that difference, and is it a goal of yours to lower that percentage or not so much?
No, it's always a goal to lower. Lower is better, but I also think we've gotten away from the notion that you're not allowed to curse at your teacher. You're not allowed to throw a block at your teacher. You're not allowed to punch another child. And that happens in schools all day long. And by the way, if you have 32 kids in kindergarten, which is what we do, and one child hits another, and all the other kids see that there is no consequence to that, you will very quickly have copycats. And so we think that having consequences where parents are involved, because another problem is that we've gotten to a point where parents drop the kids off at school and we have to do everything, and we don't believe in that. We think it's a true partnership between the home and the school, and everybody's got to take responsibility. We are very much, it takes a village to raise a child, and we have to be an incredible partnership with our parents. So when we have a hitting incident, we don't just suspend the child, we have a whole conversation with the parent about what we can do to support the child. We have restorative conversations. It's not you were suspended, you are a bad child. The restorative conversation is as important as the suspension. And if you skip that step, it will not be effective. The parent's involvement in that conversation is the most critical part of it. And then what happens? Does the kid get sent home for a day, or how does the suspension work? Well, it depends. Cheating is something that we do not tolerate, and we are very proactive with the students about integrity. And so there are different consequences for different types of activities. But, in kindergarten, there's a lot of hitting, and that's a one-day suspension. And it really is for the parent to have a conversation. And by the way, if you hit back, and this is very hard for some parents because they're used to teaching kids to defend themselves, and we say, maybe that's appropriate on the street, but we're not on the street. We're in a house of learning, and we do not hit back So if a child hits back, they too get suspended. And in kindergarten, you got a lot of that. And what ends up happening, if you look at our suspensions in kindergarten and you look at them in third grade, they are not 11%.
What happens?
It dramatically decreases because the kids learn that we mean business and we expect a certain type of conduct.
There's so much that we could talk about, so much that I want to ask you, but this is just a glimpse into the mind of Eva Moskowitz. We have many more interesting conversations to have today, so I would love to thank you for your time and thank all of you, and we'll move on to the next.